Okay, so yeah, bismillah.
Should I start? Okay.
Yeah, just be here. So just you need to be around here.
Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.
I think you need to hold it closer.
Oh, I need to hold it like this? Okay.
Has it got like a thing that you put at the top of your...
It does not. Here?
Try that before.
How's that? How's that? Does that work? I can hold it. I can hold it.
Maybe, yeah.
I think that might be too far away.
Oh, I see.
Hello? Is that okay? So I probably need to hold it like this, right? That's fine. Okay. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salatu wa salam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Thank you for the organizers of this conference. Let me, I know it takes a lot of time and effort, voluntary time and effort, and that, it's a labor of love to bring the community together and talk about Islamic thought, Islamic scholarship, and in this case, this very latest breaking innovative technology, which is artificial intelligence, and both the benefits and drawbacks that this new technology can have for Islamic scholarship and also for the Muslim community. Let me begin my stopwatch so I don't go over 30 minutes. So, when we talk about Islamic thought or Islam and AI, there are probably two or three major problems, or two or three major challenges, benefits. One is the problem of does an AI or can an AI acquire intelligence to the point that it resembles a human being that is capable of thought and understanding language and eventually even action in the world, to the point that it is something like a human being. And if so, what exactly, what do we do? How does Islamic ethics, Islamic legal theory, Islamic theology deal with this thing? That's one. The other main thing, I think, is the acting in the world part, in the sense that, if these artificial intelligences are able to do things in the world, create systems autonomously, without direction, and they do good things or bad things, how exactly do we hold them responsible from a ethical perspective, from a Shari'i perspective, right? That's also a very pressing conceptual problem, and they're related. They can be related, they can be separated as well. And finally, and really it's the thing that's going to be the main object of my thought, is as a technology, as a tool that organizes data, organizes information, organizes for us textual material. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about, is as a tool for scholars and historians and both theologians, fuqaha, all of them, they use as the core material upon which they build their thought texts. And large language models or artificial intelligence is built on texts and can generate texts and can analyze texts. So what exactly are its strengths and weaknesses for the purposes of Islamic thought, developing Islamic thought? So before I get into that particular issue, I want to talk a little bit about the history of technology as it relates to the production of Islamic thought. So in Islamic history, technological innovation is not new. In fact, our Islamic history is punctuated with major technological innovations that then have a tremendous impact, social impact, and intellectual impact. So for instance, During the time of the Prophet, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they wrote down revelations. We have hadith reports on different media, different materials, right? And obviously, the Quran was also memorized simultaneously. But during the Caliphate, this was deemed insufficient. So there was a use of a new technology, which was writing the entire Quran down in some kind of consonantal skeletal text in a mushaf, pages between two covers, as they say. This is a technological innovation that was required by the needs of the time. Similarly, there was a huge debate in early Islamic history, and during the time of the Caliphates and the Umayyad Caliphate as well. Do you write down hadith? Does it detract from the authority of the Quran? Should it only be something that's memorized, or should it be something that's written down? How should it be transmitted, right? And ultimately, this was a huge debate. It was settled in the favor of writing it down. In hadith itself, there was a huge debate. Like, when you transmit hadith, how do you cite your source? Eventually the society determined around certainly by the beginning of the 3rd century, that if possible, you should learn hadith through some kind of oral written transmission, and you should indicate that that is how you got the material by using the particular transmission haddathani or akhbarani, as opposed to an, right? This was a development. And then you have the invention of paper, right? The Chinese had invented paper. It was introduced to Islamic society in early Abbasid times, and it radically dropped the price of the material upon which you can write. So that now writing down treatises, writing down material became a lot less expensive, and therefore a lot more widespread. That had an intellectual impact. So there's a major difference between Abu Hanifa, radiallahu anhu, and his opinions, and Shafi'i. Shafi'i wrote quite extensively, provided justifications and analysis, and he has voluminous works that are, very reliably attributed to him as a sole author. And same thing with Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Shaybani, right? This coincides with the emergence of paper and the spread of paper, and that had an intellectual impact. It made essentially, like, this is Ahmed al-Shamsi, the historian of Islamic thought. He makes the argument that one factor that created the drive to have a systematic legal methodology that was coherent was the introduction of paper, because now students could go through a large volume of work. They didn't have to memorize it. They could look at different legal positions on different issues and see whether or not they're coherent. So the rise of paper gave the idea that you had to be systematic, coherent, and your legal positions had to be justified in some way, and they had to be in a state of non-contradiction. That was enabled by the use of paper. And then, you had the printing press, 19th century. 19th century printing press that dropped the price even more. You had the emergence of public educational systems where literacy became much more widespread, and that had a massive social impact. That had a massive intellectual impact. And then, a couple of centuries after the 19th century, in the late 20th century, early 21st century, we all know, with the invention of the internet, you had digitization of all of these Islamic texts. Many Islamic texts are now available on the web or in some kind of digital form that is searchable, machine searchable. So you can look for particular phases through a corpus of tens of thousands of texts, billions of words, and within a second find the particular phrase that you're looking for, right? Not only that, website like Shamada has made tens of thousands of texts available for free, so that those things that were, as long as you have an internet connection, you have a computer, right? So something that was, maybe 50 years ago, or even less, was only accessible in libraries in physical form at institutions that were capable of amassing that with a big budget. All of a sudden, all of these texts are available online to everyone. So it doesn't matter if you're a seminary student in Bangladesh, or you're at Oxford and Cambridge University, or Imperial College. You have equal access to this, as long as you have an internet connection and some kind of computation, right? So that had a huge impact. Now, what we're seeing in the past, 5-6 years, maybe less, is the introduction of this new technique called the large language model, right? Which, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what exactly is a large language model and what are its strengths, what are its weaknesses, and how can we leverage its strengths and avoid its weaknesses for the enrichment and development of Islamic thought. So before I do that, let me talk a little bit about our current moment that we're in world history, current geopolitical moment. So probably many of you know that in East Asian societies, in Western European societies, and to a lesser extent, North American societies, for the most part, they're in demographic decline. What does that mean? They're not having enough kids to replace their own populations. Not only that, those populations are trending on the older side, right? It's very important. They say in some senses, sociologically, demographics is destiny, right? You compare the Muslim population, it's the opposite, comparatively speaking, to a large extent. There is still quite a robust population growth, relatively speaking, although even in many Muslim countries, we're seeing that the birth rate is beginning to decline. However, comparatively speaking, it's higher. And perhaps even more importantly, the demographic structure, the age structure of Muslim populations is quite young, right? What does that mean? That means, in some senses, the youth bulge, they call it the youth bulge, 18 to 35 years old, and younger, it's many, many Muslims. So as naturally speaking, all things being equal, as that cohort, that generation ages in, it gathers wealth. With wealth comes power and relative amount of influence as well. So we've all seen the statistics that Islam is projected to be the largest religion in the planet in a couple of decades. So these are all very important. And I'll talk a little bit about why. The other thing, I think, has become really painfully aware since the election of the American president, Donald Trump. It's really interesting. Wherever I go, whenever they find out I'm American, the first thing they want to say is Trump. This man's a political genius, but let's not get into that. But we're living in this pivotal moment where we're seeing, I think, obviously could be wrong, I think that geopolitics balance of power is about to change quite radically. We're going from a moment in which the United States for the past 30, 40 years has been the hegemonic force that, runs the world system to probably some kind of many great powers competing with each other, with the United States for the time being the most powerful of those great powers. So the structure of the world is changing quickly. The other thing I want to say is that I want to talk a little bit about English speaking. We don't necessarily, historically, we're not trained to think about English as an Islamic language, but I think that we have to start thinking about English as an Islamic language. If you put all of the English speakers that are Muslim in the world together, right, it is not an insignificant number, right? Either English speakers like the people here in UK and the United States, minorities, or places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, or even Indonesia, where people are beginning to learn English as a second language. You put all of those people together, we're talking about 240 million people. That is not insignificant, right? Like if you put all those people together in one country, it would be a fairly large country. Like it would not be a small country. It would be, like something like the 10th largest country or something like that, right? That is important. Keep that in mind. So let me talk about this large language model. What is the large language model? So the large language model, in essence, to me, is this new technology that it takes as its input a massive amount of textual material. I mean, for us, let's talk about textual material, although it can also be trained, what they call trained on visual material as well, but textual material. And what it does through a variety of techniques that have come together in a very interesting way, mathematical techniques, algorithmic techniques, and also developments in computation, what they call GPUs or parallelizing computation. All of these kind of different independent developments came together, and they have created this new architecture where you feed this thing called a model large amounts of text, and what it is able to do is learn the fundamental semantic patterns and structure of that corpus and store the patterns, learns the patterns of that corpus and stores it. And so when you query it and when you ask it, it can, relying on its knowledge of the patterns, the semantic patterns that make up this large corpus, able to respond, right? And it does that through this neural network learning architecture. It does that by converting textual linguistic data, linguistic information like words, into some kind of a numerical representation in the form of what are called vectors, which are in a sense just a list of numbers. So you take a word, you take a sentence, you convert it into numbers, and then when you convert words into numbers, like vectors, you can do all kinds of neat mathematical operations, addition, subtraction, difference, comparison, in a very precise way that computers can do. And that is one fundamental component, one insight, one technological development that allows these large language models to take a corpus, and a corpus is like, billions and billions and billions of words, like all of the internet, and learn its structure such that a computer, even though it's not human and is not actually capable of understanding language, can tell the difference between I am at the bank of a river and I am at the bank drawing money. Both words, bank, mean two completely different things. And unless you know the definition of each of those two words of the bank, you could get confused very easily. Now, how does a large language model, so if you were to take like a 5-year-old and you gave that 5-year-old these two sentences, I'm at a bank, and I'm at a bank of a river, or I'm at a bank drawing money. Probably the 5-year-old, maybe it's a very precocious 5-year-old, is able to know one definition of that word bank, right? But not the other. So then you would have to teach that 5-year-old, well, actually the same word can mean two different things. And depending on the context, you're going to know which word is being used according to the definition, right? So how do you teach a computer that? In previous approaches, you would essentially have a dictionary that you programmed, and you would tell bank has two definitions, and you would have a series of rules. Maybe when you would have a rule that says, well, when you're talking about natural phenomenon, you rely on the definition that that refers to the side of a river. However, if you're in a context where you're talking about financial matters, refer to the bank that is a financial institution, right? So you would have to predefine all of these rules. Human speech and human language has probably an innumerable amount of such instances where words are polysemous, meaning they have multiple meanings. And then if you expand that to phrases, you know, it quickly becomes impossible to encode all of the rules that determine that will instruct by way of rules, predefined rules that the programmer gives what you should understand. So how do you overcome this problem? What neural networks do and what the large language model is built on is you just give this model examples. Examples of all of the sentences that you could find on the internet that use the term bank in a variety of different senses. And by learning the different ways in which the context in which the term bank is used, by looking at the surrounding words, the large language model is capable of learning by way of examples, not by way of predefined rules, you know, the distinction and difference between the two different uses of bank. So you feed this examples, it turns those examples into numbers, it stores, it goes through a process of many different layers, and it learns the patterns that make up the text that you feed it, and it stores those patterns in a very interesting distributed way across all what are called parameters. And these large language models have billions of millions and billions of parameters, right? And in that process, in those distributed parameters across different layers and embeddings and all that kind of stuff, it stores not definitions, not words, but patterns in some kind of a numerical format, right? So the strength of it is, when it comes to Islamic studies scholarship, is if I am looking for a concept, like for instance, I'm very interested in the idea, the principle that says there is no duty to obey creation or a human being if it entails disobedience to the creator, right? Super important legal principle, super important moral principle, super important political principle, right? But even if you take a digitized corpus that's machine searchable, you're going to, you know, and let's say it's a massive corpus. We've all, probably most of us have used Maktab al-Shamila, right? To find instances in which that phrase occurs, it's trivial. Like within a second, it can find all instances of, like, you know, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000, millions of texts, all of text. If all of the Islamic texts in the entire world were digitized, it would take a second. And machine searchable, it would take a second to find all instances. But the problem is, you know, that idea is expressed in not an innumerable, probably a wide variety of different phrases. And sometimes it is not referred to explicitly, but implicitly, right? So the problem with machine searchable digitized text is it is incapable of finding all instances of the citation of that principle, either if it varies in expression or if it is kind of implied, right? So here we hit a limitation. But if you have a large language model that has trained on the entirety, not just Islamic text, but all human text, essentially, you know, Claude, ChatGPT, all of these large language models, they have been trained on the entire internet, everything, trillions, trillions and trillions of words, right? And so they have picked up not just the structure of one language, but all languages in a sense, and stored it in their parameters. So because they have memorized and learned patterns and not expressions, meanings, not the actual phrase, you can potentially ask it, and it will retrieve, it will respond to you in potentially a much more robust way, right? That's the strength. The strength is in this pattern recognition and learning a pattern from a corpus. Weaknesses, I'm sure all of you have used ChatGPT, Claude, is this idea of hallucination. Have you ever heard this term hallucination? So hallucination is these models will invent facts, citations, because the way that they're engineered and structured, they do not know how to say, I don't know. They're getting better at that, but still that danger is always there, even in the latest, greatest models. So what does that mean? On the one hand, you have this incredible strength, incredible ability. On the other hand, you have this weakness, which is, you have many weaknesses. It can fabricate facts. It cannot tell you, it does not necessarily tell you where it is getting its information from. It does not necessarily have the ability in and of itself, a large language model in and of itself, of telling you, well, it's this idea of there's no duty to obey creation, a human being, if it entails disobedience to the creator, is found in Sarakhsi's Mabsut and Mawardi's work, right? And Kasani's work, and the Siyasa Shar'iyya work. It's not gonna, or in this, maybe the idea is found implicitly, but not in the exact phrase in this particular hadith in this collection, right? That is super important for scholarship. And that is something that the Islamic intellectual tradition has always been incredibly interested in and motivated by, and which was a very high intellectual value, which is the ability to demonstrate transparently the connection between the idea that you're proposing and scripture and previous writings, precedent, and being very explicit about the chains of reasoning and the chains of authority that support or oppose the particular idea that you're discussing. The very fact of the isnad is a testament to this concern with the ability to demonstrate exactly which sources I'm getting at. So you have this large language model that hallucinates, that is not capable of giving its sources, and then you have our intellectual tradition, which is very powerful. We all know how powerful it is, right? So how do you develop techniques that will use the strength but mitigate the weaknesses, right? So basically, that's the catch. And what I propose is a more conservative use of large language models that utilizes its pattern recognition abilities, but avoids its weaknesses. How do you do that? There are a couple of ways. There are three different ways. One is you create a large language model from scratch, right? So, ChatGPT is trained on the entire internet, probably including the Arabic, Persian, Urdu sources, whatever, Islamic language sources as well, whatever is available on the internet, whatever is available in some kind of digitized machine searchable form. They have cleaned that in some sense or way, segmented that in some sense or way, fed it to the model through this architecture, and then the model is the distributed numerical representation of the patterns that make up that corpus. And it is through that is able to answer the questions that you pose it, along with some other things as well, right? So we can do that, build our own model using our own textual repository. Or that's expensive, takes a lot of time. Or you can, what they call, fine-tune an existing model. So there are hundreds, maybe thousands of models ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, these are the largest commercial grade, what they call frontier models. And, probably cost, not probably, tens of millions of dollars. Some of the latest iterations of these cost tens of millions of dollars to develop. Some future version, they're saying hundreds of millions of dollars, maybe billions of dollars. But there are actually thousands of them. And fine tuning is got 5 minutes? Okay. Fine tuning is not building from scratch, but you take an existing model and you feed it your own data and you actually ask it to do very specific tasks. So for instance, I'm teaching a class this quarter at UC Davis, 11 students, and we're exploring Islam and AI. And the project that I've given these 11 students, they come from different backgrounds. Some of them are computer scientists, some of them are humanities, social sciences people. We've divided up the work. We have created we have like about 500 biographical dictionaries. This is a very important genre in Islamic thought. And what I want to do is take this genre and extract certain values from each biography. So for instance, give me the name, give me the gender, give me the death year, give me the birth year, give me, if it's a narrator, the evaluation of the narrator's credibility, how good of a narrator. Give me who their teachers were, who their students were, which books they wrote, where did they live, where did they die, important events that took place in their life, right? So imagine if we took these 500 biographical dictionaries that contain maybe 300,000 individual biographies, and we were to create a table with these 16, 17, 20 categories of information and 300,000 rows, all of a sudden you have a very powerful resource for reconstructing many aspects of Islamic history that you're interested in. Like for instance, within a second, give me all of the women, notable figures that we have information on. All right, very important for us to know this, right? So how do you use these large language models, fine tune these large language models? So you give it a very specific task, right? Take as an input this biography of this individual, return as an output these 20 fields of data. So if you take a very conservative approach, right, and you can check that, then what you essentially do is use the large language model as a tool to annotate a data set that then becomes, and you do much rigorous quality assurance on that data, whether or not that model is performing well, and you have created a data set that is hopefully reliable, maintains a transparent genetic connection to the information where it's getting it from, and that is also, now able to be used by scholars. In order to do this, and I'll end this, give me 1 minute. In order to do this, some kind of project like this, you basically need collaboration between the technologists, software engineers, and you need Islamic studies scholars as well. And they have to learn to, the Islamic studies scholars have to learn a little bit about large language models, software, but they know the textual corpus and what kinds of questions are very interesting, what kinds aren't. And then the technologists have to learn a little bit about the genre, this textual tradition, and they have knowledge about how do you fine tune these models. If you can get a collaboration between these two groups of people, there is a lot of very interesting things that is very important that you can do. And I'll end with that. Thank you for your attention.
Questions?